Oh, hi, I'm Eve Lazarus. I'm a local history and true crime author, and it's my pleasure to be hosting Aaron's book event today. A couple of things before we go. I've just been asked to tell you that Aaron's book is available through Iron Dog Books, which is just up on the mezzanine mezzanine.
Mezzanine.
Thank you.
Mezzanine.
What he said. As you come in. And I've also been asked to let you know that you can support the festival online through their silent auction at wordvancouver.com. And now I've got the housekeeping done, it's my pleasure to introduce Aaron Chapman. Now, I met Aaron over 10 years ago when we both worked on a book called Vancouver Confidential. It was put together and edited by John Belshaw and made up of essays from 14 different writers. And we were a really motley mix of reporters and authors. I was jotting them down as I was doing this. Musicians, bloggers, actors, filmmakers, tour guides, a couple of academics and a couple of crime analysts and one artist. And it was a really terrific experience. And, we continue to support each other, work together and on all sorts of different projects. And it's great. So Aaron Chapman here is a writer, historian and musician with a special interest in both Vancouver's entertainment and crime history. He is the author of Vancouver After Dark, The Wild History of the City's Nightlife, winner of the Bill Duthie Booksellers' Choice Award, the BC Book Prizes, in 2020, The Last Gang in Town, the story of Vancouver's Clark Park Gang, Liquor Lust and the Law, the story of Vancouver's Penthouse Nightclub, now available in a second edition, and Live at the Commodore, a history of a Commodore ballroom that won the Bill Duthie Booksellers' Choice Award, BC Book Prizes in 2015. His latest book is Vancouver Vice, Crime and Spectacle in Vancouver's West End, that was a finalist in the Best True Crime Book Award of 2020 by the Crime Writers of Canada Association. In 2020, he was elected as a member of the Royal Historical Society, Royal Historical Society. He was born and raised in Vancouver. So, Aaron,
Eve, I'm so happy to be here with you. We have a long history of Vancouver history writing together, and I'm honored that you chose to or were able to do this. I must return the favor when your book, which is coming out very shortly,
yes.
Your new book comes out too. So
did everyone hear that? Because I'm taking it up.
I'd be happy to do it. Yeah.
But I thought we'd start. Who's read the book? And it's okay if you haven't.
Yeah. Hey, there we go.
Not many. So let's start. How about giving us an elevator pitch of the book?
Sure. Well, Vancouver Vice is based on it sort of sets a period in the west end of the city in the late 70s and the early 1980s. That it's interesting that if you lived in Vancouver or were born and raised in Vancouver or you lived through those periods, you'll certainly remember those years. They were very controversial. They were on the news all the time, having to do with the issues of sex workers in the West End and street prostitution right on the streets of the West End in Vancouver. But if you moved to Vancouver in the 1990s, or you maybe moved here in the last 20 years, you would have no idea that this period ever happened to the city in Vancouver. It's all gone. It's nothing that neighborhood offers no hint, except for the West End Sex Workers Memorial, which is the lamp post. It's just off Davie and Jervis. I think it is, or Jervis, yeah. And it was looking a little bit pink, but it was supposed to be red. The light bulbs faded a little bit. I think they put a new one in there that's a little more reddish, but it was supposed to be the red light, sort of the red light zone symbol of course, the West End, and was just put there a few years ago. But I'd been thinking about that, and as somebody who was living in Vancouver at the time, I was a kid then, but I certainly knew on the news you'd see it every night, and there was so much controversy up until about 1984 having to do with that. I thought it'd be interesting to look back on that. And the book really, Vancouver Vice, is a little bit of a sort of an offshoot of another book I wrote called The Last Gang in Town, that has to do with the east side of Vancouver and some East End street gang history having to do with the infamous, legendary Clark Park gang. And in that book, I'm making a very long answer here for you. I hope you don't mind doing it.
It's a long elevator.
It's a very long elevator. It's an 80-story building here. And there was a police officer, Vancouver retired VPD officer by the name of Al Robson, who has sort of a bit of a cameo in that book. And it's funny, when that book came out, Last Gang in Town, it's interesting because I heard from all the old gang members and said, hey, everybody, that book came out just before Christmas. And they said, geez, every every hoodlum in East Van, every Hell's Angel got your book for Christmas and they like it. And I thought, well, geez, there's a weird review. And then I heard from the retired police community around that same time, and Brian Honeyborn, another officer who's spotlighted in that book, called me and said, geez, every ex-cop or retired cop in the city of Vancouver got your book for Christmas, and they're all calling me saying they liked it. So I thought, God, I somehow managed to steer the Titanic through the iceberg field on that one with both sides. But when the book came out, I have the feeling that some of these police officers may have not read anything aside from a Louis L'Amour novel or something in many years. And Robson called me up and said, hey, I really liked your book. I thought it was well done. You were fair, and your treatment of everything. I got some more stories I can tell you. So I went out and had a couple of pints with him. And a story that he happened to tell me that had everything to do with Wayne Harris and the investigation that he was a part of in 1977. He told me in about a 90-second period. And it was one of those things when, as a writer, you hear, and it hits you so hard, you think, that's going to be my next book. Right then and there, you decide, I'm going to devote the next 2 or 3 years of my life to this. I didn't know this walking in, but boom, you get hit with a wrecking ball like that. And it was such a crazy story to me that I knew that's what I wanted to do. So it kind of, I had other things in mind as well. So I had to completely sort of shift what I was going to do. But that's sort of what I've decided upon. And I thought it was an interesting time because we were sort of reaching an anniversary year of some of this stuff, some 40 years later and 50 years later, that I thought it'd be interesting to look back on this time and look back on a period of Vancouver that's kind of vanished. But, the more things change, the more they stay the same to a certain degree. While the issues, while some of the issues that the Vancouver Vice Squad tackled back then are gone today, arguably, in some cases, and we don't even have a Vice Squad today in Vancouver anymore. There's no actual Vice Squad that's a part of the VPD anymore. I thought it'd be interesting to sort of look at that and see how, as well, my memories of Vancouver, particularly in the 1970s and 80s, being a lot more pious, if I can use that word. There was a little bit more sense of morality and religion, and that's kind of vanished all over North America. It's not just what's happening in Vancouver, but there's been less that we sort of marched away a little bit from that. But as a kid, I remember, Bernice Gerard in Vancouver. I remember how much, you couldn't get a drink on Sundays in Vancouver. You had to drive to Point Roberts to get a drink. And if you describe this today, somebody who's living in Vancouver, they'd think, what are you talking about, the 1950s? No, I'm talking about the 1970s and 80s. So I thought it'd be an interesting time to look back on some of those things, and as well, beyond this, and we're reaching the 80th floor of the building now, so I have to find out what I'm saying, is also that there had been a look back at that period of sex worker history in Vancouver, and there had been some proclamations which I didn't necessarily 100% agree with, or I thought they were more complex than they were necessarily trying to be laid out by friends of mine, Becky Ross and Jamie Lee Hamilton, who were spokespeople about that West End sex workers war. And there was a few complexities I wanted to challenge a little bit on them about. So that's in many ways how it came together. And I had a really good time writing Last Gang in Town, which was a true crime book. And that maybe, I guess, the first one I'd done, although the Penthouse book has a little bit of that too. And I was eager to sort of try that and try and tackle it again. That's about it. Yeah.
What I found really interesting, because I came to Vancouver sort of mid-80s and all that had gone. West End was just the West End. And, I spent all of my summers down there. I spent a lot of time going through those lovely little boulevards and little streets. And I didn't have a clue how they came about until I read your book. So maybe you could talk to that.
Oh, well, I mean, the one of the few things really left over from those years, if people who walk around the West End or bike around the West End probably don't really recognize it so much because you can travel fairly easy. If you're a driver through the West End, you'll wonder why you can't, I can't turn down this street. Wait, I can't turn down here. Well, those are all sort of leftover things because in November 1981, street barricades were put in. Now, in the beginning, the barricades now are sort of curbs, or they basically elongated some of the curbs, or in many cases, they've cut off the sidewalks and there's a little sort of mini parklet in front of the building. Now, so you kind of walk through areas of the West End and think, geez, this two apartment buildings on the west and east side, they've got their own little park here, little places to sit, or what wonderful, somebody decided the right thing. All of those are essentially born out of the fact that a lot of those corners, right, like Nicola and down by, there's I talk about them in the book, each one of them, but those were all centers where those were corners that were very active for, sex workers of all varieties, transgender, male, female, whatever you have, and they were sort of shut down by the city trying to shut down. Interesting enough that just before that, the preceding years before that, the city had decided that some of those areas needed traffic calming measures anyway. So some of those ones were going in, but there were some specific ones like the one on Nicola and the one which is the cover of the book actually, and a few others that were put in basically, and they were left over. And at the time, neighbors complained saying, "Oh my God, I can't park in front of my building anymore. What the heck is going on? The city's gone to hell." You know, if you try to remove those now, saying, "Well, we don't really need these anymore. You know, we may as well open these streets up." There would be, "You can't take those away. I've had that. I love that park in front of me." You know, so. It's, you know, again, we just like to complain in Vancouver. That's one of our national sports that we are good at, I think so, yeah.
But you also mentioned, which I love, that everything that the police did to try to solve the whole solution or problem of prostitution backfired, and that was one of the
Very much so, yeah. You know, it's almost to the point, it is sort of a farce, you know, the initial, it's interesting to see how the problem grew in the West End through those years. And this was sort of what happened really sort of set neighbors against one another, and it was really sort of almost a little sort of a civil war in the West End. That people, if you lived on one corner, you really observed nothing. You thought, what was the problem with anything? But you know, just another corner away, if you lived there, you would hear, you know, there would be activity all night and whatnot. By not so much even the sex workers; they weren't even to blame. It was the people cruising down there and looking around, or just honking their horn or yelling, or they were causing street problems. You know, so it's interesting how it developed. You know, initially, street prostitution had sort of changed in the city of Vancouver by the very nature of things. Initially, it had been involved in hotel lounges and nightclubs. There were some famous. I mean, the Western Bayshore was very popular for you know that in the 50s or not. It wasn't there in the 50s, 60s, and into the 70s. And then later on at the Penthouse nightclub, that was a sort of famous place where the you know, working girls were working out of and whatnot. And then when the Penthouse was shut down, the problem was sort of pushed out in the streets. It had always been a situation in the East End, in the downtown East Side, and it had been in the West End, stopped up in about the 1940s. But it's interesting what happened, because as soon as they pushed it out in the streets, people started to complain. So then it moved into the apartment buildings. And if you lived, you know, in an apartment building and you think, geez, there's a lot of guys going out of that place in that woman's suite in 205 there. I wonder what's going on. That became a problem. And people started complaining, well, there's sex workers working out of my apartment building here. So it got pushed back out in the streets again. And then when people complained about the streets, they went to the police, and the police pushed it to the side streets. And then no longer businesses on Davie Street complained. Then it was the people in the residences that complained. And then they put the traffic barriers in, and that just slowed the traffic down. So it allowed people driving in cars to have more time to negotiate a price. Everything they did, time and time again, backfired, almost to the point it was a comedy of errors at one point. Obviously, what should have happened is somebody should have said, look, we need a red light district. We have to, that's the only way to deal with this problem anymore. But that would have been a very difficult ask in 1970s Vancouver. And I think it would be even a more difficult ask now, because even though maybe our morality has changed and whatnot, in this city where property values are king, who wants to say, yeah, I'll put that next to my house, that's fine. You know, like nobody, there would be just as much opposition, strangely enough. In the end, technology probably solved some of our problems, that so much of that has moved online, you know, but there's still, you know, there's still street sex workers in the downtown East Side, you know, like we don't see it in the West End anymore. But it's interesting to see how we wrestled with the problem over the years.
It's probably gone back into the apartment buildings.
And it's gone back to the apartment buildings. Yeah, yeah, very much so. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. You know, one of the people you wrote about was Wendy King, and that's always fascinated me. And that was when, in the 80s, 70s?
Early 80s, 80.
Do you remember that at all? She was a madam, Wendy King, and she ended up bringing down a Supreme Court judge. But I just found all of that so fascinating, because you heard about Wendy King, you got her address, you heard everyone that worked for her. There was no privacy at all. Everything went out there. Yet there was never one John, I don't think, mentioned ever, except for that Supreme Court judge.
Yeah, what that case was a situation that was a woman by the name of Wendy King who was working basically had a madam in her apartment that she was running out of. What was the address now? It's still there, that building.
It's still there.
That apartment building is still there. I wanted to ring the buzzer and say, did you know you were living in the, you know, but didn't want to scare the neighbors or anything like that. But it was a sensational story at the time, because she had a little black book of all her clients that she had as well. And there were names apparently of some very well-known people to Vancouver that had been through there. But in as much as she caught all the flack for, for working as a prostitute, solicitation, and whatnot. And it was interesting how that case came together, because her boyfriend initially was sort of what drew police to that, and there's a little bit of mystery, but she kind of got the book thrown at her, and none of the Johns, none of her that were visiting her really paid any price, or their names weren't drugged through the muck, except for this Supreme Court judge who was involved. Yeah, it's an interesting case where some people gained some notoriety, other people like Wayne Harris really was an unknown figure, I think, really until this book's come out. So.
Well, you had a really interesting time with this book. I mean, you had the ending in mind, I think, didn't you?
Yes.
Before you started, and
yes,
that changed. Maybe you could talk
yeah,
about
it's an interesting thing as a writer. If I don't know how many writers in the room or people who write books or whatnot. You don't have to be, but when you're plotting these things out, you think you've got a pretty good idea of maybe beginning, middle, and ending, and you know where you're going to go with it and whatnot. And I had been given, in particular, a document, sort of like classified, for lack of a better word. It was never published within the VPD, but it was an investigation into child exploitation done by the Vancouver Police Department, and in particular focused on the investigation that I had mentioned in the book in 1977, and some of the surrounding people around it up until the present day, which basically drew a line through some of the people in Vancouver and that were perpetrating some of these crimes who were still around and had gone without arrest or prosecution. When I got the document, I showed it to a provincial court judge of mine who was a friend, and he said, first of all, where did you get this? And I showed it to some other people, and they all said, this is a heck of a hand grenade to have. You got to be careful with it. And I showed it to my publisher, and I talked about, look, I'm going to focus on this document and what it says in the ending. And arguably, considering some of the names mentioned in it, it could make national news. And I thought we certainly had to be careful with that, some of the allegations in it. I had criticisms of the document itself because I had spoken to some of the very officers that they named were involved in the surveillance project, having to do with the character in the book, Wayne Harris, and some of the people he was involved with. And they got some things wrong. There were some real bad typos in there as well. So I thought, I got to be careful how I deal with this. But I had sort of envisioned that as the end of the book. And when I wrote basically the first draft and submitted it, publisher said, look, we're going to get sued if we publish this just as is. And I thought, well, that's the fun of this thing, isn't it? But but I realized, okay, we had to sort of assuage it and kind of, I had to be careful and maybe back off some things that I sort of tried again. They said, look, this is really problematic. We don't think, my publisher said, one of them sort of said, we don't even think you really need to go into this. I think it's a sort of a strong enough book. And I said, well, that's kind of my ending. It sort of proves everything that was going on. And at the same time, there were issues with the document itself, because at the end of it, basically the police said that they weren't going to investigate any further because they weren't going to press charges on anybody named, because they had looked into this and they didn't think there was anything else to follow up, when the whole nature of what the document was and what the police VPD guys in the trenches had built and submitted this thing was to say, look, we need more investment. We're not saying charges. Let's further down the road. What we need to do is take a serious look at this. And in between that time, the surveillance that was done between telephone surveillance and photographic surveillance and police basically sneaking up to the windows to try and capture what these people were doing had all been destroyed. And this also went into, the book sort of goes into basically how archival, and this always bugs history people like you and I,
God, yes.
and especially people who are looking for police reports for historical purposes and whatnot, to find out that somebody said, that stuff's 20 years old, we just decided to shred it, or we decided to destroy it. And you think, and that's common because...
And that's, by the way, with murder weapons,
yes,
blood, clothes, just about anything you can think
yeah.
of. Whoops, sorry, threw it out 20 years ago.
It's shocking how much, it's rare when you find somebody's kept something, and you've certainly looked into some of those cases. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I had to be careful, even if an investigation was going to be reopened, basically on the strength of what I was trying to say in the book, it would have been difficult because outside of the memories of the officers that I talked to, who are now in their 70s and 80s, there was really nothing to go back to. So for those of you who read the book, or whether you've not, what I tried to do in the ending was, because I was against what my publisher, Arsenal Press, they've actually published all 5 of my books, so I'm very grateful to them, and I'm grateful for the advice they gave me. And while I was kind of, well, that's my ending, it took away my ending in the beginning. I came around to what they were saying, because at the same time, you don't want to go the other way and be a gossip monger and just put this stuff out without,
or lose your house.
Yeah, exactly, or get sued. Yeah, but I thought I had enough that I could at least put forward what was being said, and also at the same time be critical of the Vancouver Police Department for throwing this stuff out.
Yep.
And a lot of the the in the trenches police that were involved in these investigations were horrified that this stuff that they had worked on had all been just sort of discarded in the end, because they realized themselves there were people that got away potentially with murder, and it sticks out to me as one of the most amazing stories of Vancouver crime history I'd ever heard. And so I don't know. And when we were talking the other night, I said, I don't know in the end, if you want to ask me this question, was the book a success in that regard? Did it do everything I wanted to do? Or when you're a writer, when you have to change your ending like that, which I did, and I probably have to go back and read this 6 months from now and see how I feel about it. I looked at it the other day and I thought, that's pretty good. I did a pretty good job there. That's a good sentence there, and all the sort of things like that. But I did have to change things, and maybe that the big ending at the end I had to change, and I don't know if the book did everything I wanted to do because of that. And there was a part of me that thought, well, maybe this will trigger enough that maybe that document or some of the other people will start talking about some of this stuff, or some of the people who were victims would maybe come forward and whatnot. And that really hasn't happened yet. There are so many people from this era that are dead. A litany of them, died from either from well, a lot of people died from AIDS. That wrecking ball just went through the West End, and I still think in Vancouver we have yet to fully come to grasp or reconcile what happened with that. There's so many people from the arts community, let alone that people who would be out producing plays or had little clothing stores or were active in that all those game pieces were just swept off the board when all those people passed. But there are a lot of people who because of the lifestyles they were living with drugs or alcohol or whatnot, they're dead. There's quite a few people who were victims of foul play, so there's not many people left to tell the story or step forward. I was grateful by the number of retired Vice Squad people who trusted me enough with their material. And I think Last Gang helped with that, because they could see what I was sort of trying to do with the material or that era of policing, even because some of this is Wild West days, pre-charter of rights and freedoms, when a lot of police, had keys to the telephone room in the building, and basically if they wanted to wire tap a phone, were you going to fill out a form? No, we just open up the door and we put the 2 hooks on the thing and listen in. As I say, kind of crazy days of policing in Vancouver too. That in the age of cell phones, you can't do that kind of thing. Not just because you can't connect to the phone, but people are, filming you all the time. So it was a different era as well, and I always find that interesting how different people's jobs and lives were in just relatively few short years ago.
I think, as a writer researcher too, we rely on these retired cops to tell us what's going on because of the lack of information. Did you file FOIs for this?
I did, and I always...
they're freedom of information.
Freedom of information requests of the Vancouver Police Department. Yeah, I certainly have, and I know a couple people down there, when they see an Aaron Chapman request, they go, oh God, not another one of these. We're going to have to go in that real dusty part of the warehouse that no one ever asks about anymore to find this and such file. And in the case of this, it's funny because in the case of this story, there's some photos of the crime scene, the central crime scene that the book starts off with in the first chapter, which is out on just by Lost Lagoon there. A murder on Lost Lagoon. I always thought that was a great, sensational way to start. Anyway, sounds like a creature from the Black Lagoon or something. But it starts with that, and a police officer that had been involved in that investigation. I don't want to say whether or not he was living or dead or whatnot, but his family had his material as well, and they showed me the file that he had kept, which I had photos of the very crime scene. So I notes from the file. So basically, when I filed my FOI request with the Vancouver Police Privacy Office, and what's her name down there? I don't know if you deal with the same person I do. Yeah. Anyway,
they just say no.
Oh, they say no to you. Maybe I brought them a box of chocolates and they like me or something. I said, look, this is what I need. And I think they were alarmed to find, God, you're asking like a lot of questions. You know what's in the file already. And I said, well, yes, I do, but I'm trying to do this officially through you. And I know what the photo looks like. And I know that the body in the trunk that I describe is, you can't see that body. So there's nothing gratuitous. It's interesting because what the VP does, if they have crime scenes that are quite grisly, they're not going to give you those. The old joke is that if there's a photo of a suicide and somebody falls off the building and they land face up where you can see who it is, they won't give you the picture because of privacy reasons. But if the body falls face down where you can't see it, they will give you the privacy photos because nobody's face is being,
Not know that.
Yeah. And so what tends to happen is you kind of I have to appeal because they don't give me any, it's interesting because homicide files from the 1970s in Vancouver Police Department are basically about a file folder, legal file folder, maybe 50 pages or something like that. Something like that now is boxes and boxes of stuff, and it's funny when you read the old file folders, it seems like the same half dozen guys are all working the same homicide cases. It's just like, are these the only 6 guys that didn't even work, or anything like that? What was everybody else having coffee and donuts? So it's interesting what you can ask for and what they'll give you. In this case, and the photo's in the book, I should show it. It's the back of the car and the trunk is open, and you can only see the blankets that were in the back, which were sort of covering the corpse that was in the trunk. It was stashed there the morning of May 1984 on Lost Lagoon there. And they wouldn't give it to me. And I said, well, look, I have a picture of this anyway. So I'm just going to put it in the book, whether you kind of give it to me or not. And because there's nothing gratuitous there. And I appealed it, and they sent me the photo, and they sent me the photo back, but they covered up the license plate. That was redacted. Well, we know, I say in the book whose car it is. There's not, and I find I think it's something that needs to change. And this is probably from federal government on down to municipal government, in terms of the privacy issues that are around things that historians and journalists try to access in terms of law enforcement. It's ponderous to me that in the case of that awful stabbing situation that was just a couple of weeks ago in the prairies there's still no information about what happened, and they say, well, it's part of the investigation, and just like, how long we have to wait for these things. And I understand there's certainly things that law enforcement has to keep to themselves as part of investigating something, but it seems like it takes, even in the case of a solved crime, which is what the nature of the central murder investigation that's in the book. This is a solved crime. The person went to jail, and they still don't give out stuff that easily. And I think it's a detriment because I think in the end, sometimes it just comes back to say, well, the police aren't doing any of their work. They're not doing their job. And they are, but they're not telling you. In the case of some of the missing people that have happened in the downtown east side recently, that their bodies were turned up. Chelsea Pullman, the Noel Soup. I know I know distinctly what's happened in that Soup case from speaking to the investigators, but none of that's reached the public. And the attitude towards, well, police aren't doing their job, obviously, it's like, well, they are to a great degree, but they're not telling anybody about it.
They're not talking to the family.
And they're not even talking to the family. So I think that has to change, and that's something I'm more and more aware of.
I've taken them on too in this book, and I think I told you about the RCMP.
Yes.
So I was doing part of my book that's coming out is dealing with missing people, and the RCMP put out statistics every year, and there's 30,000 missing people, and there's no context for these statistics. So I wrote to them and said, I'd like to clarify some of this, and I got this great email back saying, well, we are the RCMP, we are a brand, and if you want these statistics, you'll have to sign a licensing agreement.
Ridiculous.
And it just went on and on and on about all the things I would have to do to get this information. And, I wrote back and I said, look, I'm not writing a book about the RCMP. I'm trying to get clarification on your numbers, your publicly accessible numbers, and I got nowhere at all. So I really actually enjoyed writing the introduction because I, talk about Chelsea Pullman and some of this, transparency, the total lack of transparency.
It's something that I think is, as I say, a detriment to the police because it just makes public attitude think they're not doing anything. Yeah. And in many cases they are. There's a lot going on, but they're just not talking about it.
Well, and the unsolved ones, in many cases, they're not doing anything. Haven't done it for decades, can't find where the file is. Yeah. But they stand behind and say, I'm sorry, it's unsolved, we can't talk about it. Yeah. And it needs to be way more transparency.
It's interesting, in the case of the last gang in town, they phoned me at the police museum phoned me at one point and said they had just received the police department headquarters on Main Street at 312 Main there closed. I guess the department didn't know what to do with a lot of boxes. I don't know. Give it to the police museum. Maybe they'll take it. Maybe they can do something with it. So the archivists there were kind of looking through it. And they said, Aaron, there's a bunch of photos here. I think this is some of the people you're looking into. Everybody's got their red Mac jackets on, and they all look like old EastEnders from the 1970s. And do you want to have a look at this stuff? And I said, yeah, I'll come by tomorrow. I looked at it, and then I realized what they had, and I said, I'll buy copies of this right now, because I realized they didn't know what they were sitting on. And I didn't want them to say I couldn't have it after when I told them what it was. And they had photos of a couple of different surveillance investigations too there. So I said, yeah, I'll take copies of these now. I tried to be casual about it. Yeah, I guess I'll get a couple copies of these, something like that. And then as soon as it was like the old, the Home Depot commercial. Start the car, as soon as I got out of wanted to get out of there with my goods, yeah, it's funny how that is, and it's something I'm more and more aware of, and talk to people like other people like yourselves that sort of work in some of the same fields or spotlight some of the same history. It's the over privacy concerns, and I realize that in this day and age of electronic media and our names and our numbers being everywhere, that there has to be some guardrails in place. But in terms of some of the law enforcement stuff, there should be more open to the public. Especially, it's night and day as compared to the United States. What a U.S. citizen has access to, which we don't in this country, is night and day. So,
and that's kind of nice. I like that. But when you're looking at genetic genealogy, which is solving just hundreds of cases, south of the border, and we're not using that at all. And apparently, the RCMP are now making a policy of what they will and will not investigate, and it's going to be really restrictive.
Yeah.
So they've just done a couple of cases here, and it just kills me because they've got all these unsolved murders that could actually be solved if they've not thrown out all the DNA, which is also a possibility. But yeah, it's quite different.
Yeah.
And much more difficult to do that genetic genealogy here, where the privacy laws are so difficult. Interesting.
Yeah.
Got on a tangent there.
No, it's good. It's good. Yeah.
So, anyone else have questions while we're just chatting more?
Yes.
So if I got this right, and I made a daydream for a minute, that freedom of information does not mean access to information if you apply, is that correct?
No, it's a bit of an oxymoron, isn't it? Yeah, it should be freedom of information if they'll release it.
So is that dependent on your profession or your family?
No, anyone should be entitled to file a freedom of information request, but whether they'll honour it or not is another thing. Now, Aaron you have much more luck with that than I do. I'm usually researching unsolved murders, and they'll just say no, even if it's 70 years old, I'll get this.
Is that why?
Technically, all homicides in the city of Vancouver are still on. They will keep those on file because that's considered a major crime, serious crime. If you want to if you remember your house got broken into in 1987 and you wonder whatever became of that, you go back. They've thrown that out now. Whether that was solved or they caught who stole your stuff or whatever, that's gone. But major crimes are. But in terms of if it's unsolved or not solved, it could be a wide variety of things, and it really depends the questions that you ask. That was something I had to learn. You try and phrase the questions to sort of give all of the above, but it's a matter of asking. I need a crime scene description and a crime scene synopsis. I think those two words are sort of interchangeable. They're not, to a certain degree. So you have to ask. I've had, thankfully, with the books I've done, some of the retired police that I deal with have been generally favorable to it, even though I think I describe them sometimes just as bad in The Last Gang in Town. But that's the way they were, that I think there's a general fairness thing. So I have had instances where I have inquired about something or read who was an investigating officer just in the newspaper archives. So have that. So you can track down the guy and say, hey, do you know much about this? And they'll tell me more as a private citizen now than they will via the police department channels or filing an FOI request. And there's other times where I've contacted an active duty, how can I say this the right way? I'll say he's an inspector. And saying, look, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm trying to figure out something that's in this file. If I ask for this, and this, am I missing something? And the person in question said, well, Aaron, what is this having to do? And I started describing that. And he goes, well, let me pull the file. Let's see what's there. And I thought, okay, And he got it and he said, well, I'm just reading it here. And I basically had him just read it out to me. And I recorded the whole conversation. There's no way I could write down as fast as he was reading. It was like reading the book, but I almost had everything there. So when I did file the FOI, again, the police department was like, it sounds like this guy's already read the file. I was like, well, I have, but I'm not telling you how I got it. There's been other times where I've been in somebody's office and I asked to look at something and they had a surveillance. They had a wiretap report, actually. And I said, well, the guy said to me, he said, well, Aaron, I can't give you a copy of this, obviously, but I've got to go to the next room and make a phone call. And I thought, like an idiot, I didn't. Oh, should I leave or do I need to come back? And he goes, no, you understand. You understand. I have to go to the next room and make a phone call, and I'll be back in about 3-4 minutes. And I said, okay, yes, oh, sure then. And then I thought, I looked around the room thinking, is there cameras on me right now? Am I trying to get? Are they trying to capture me or bust me for? I looked at that and I went and I took my phone out and like a spy in a Cold War movie, I was flipping through the books and photographing each page, and then sort of sat down sweating, and I managed to get stuff that way. Another time, and this was just during the beginning of the pandemic. I had said to this one, I said, well, Aaron, I got the file here that you were looking for on something, and he read a few things out of me. He said, that's great. I'd love to still meet you in person if we can, just because he was talking about a number of photos and he was describing what was in them, but I thought it'd be easier even if I just looked at them, had a chance to see them that way. I'm not necessarily gonna take pictures of them because I didn't think they were that really photos I could use, but to help me to understand more. And he said, yeah, where do you live? Come meet you. And I said, well, there's not really, all the coffee shops are closed because of the pandemic, I'm down by the Pacific Central train station down there. And he goes, I'll meet you down at the train station. And this was a guy I hadn't met in person before. I'd only talked to an email. So I said, well, I'll be the guy in the blue jacket with the stripe on it and redheaded guy. And he goes, I'll find. It felt like I was in a movie or something because, you almost thought, okay, you put your umbrella up and I'll know that's you, kind of thing. And right there in the train station, we looked over the file, and I could ask him some questions. And he knew some of the people that were retired that were just above him when he was starting out. It was quite a fascinating conversation, but really helpful. Now, that's stuff that if I go through regular police department channels, they're not going to give me. They don't lift much of a finger in that regard. So it's, and Eve and I are probably two writers, I would say, of anybody in town that have probably the best relationship with some of the retired police community, at least some specific people that we can ask, say, hey, do you know, is this guy still alive that I can ask him? Oh yeah, I played golf with him the other day. I'll get him to give you a call, stuff like that. And they're not going to get into things that, I don't know about you. I would never tell people I'm a journalist or I'm a writer. I tell people I'm a historian, which is what I think I am, but they're reticent to talk to a journalist because they're worried about somebody having some gotcha moment on them. And then they're only talking to the press. That doesn't die when they retire. But they'll talk to a historian. For some reason.
No, I always go with a reporter. Or
do you? See, I never do.
See, I'm not a historian.
Yeah.
I'm not even sure what that is. What is a historian?
Well, after the years of university, I thought I may as well use it because I paid for it.
I was kind of impressed though when I was reading that Royal Historical Society.
Yes.
What is that?
It's in the UK. It's and I, in 2017, I traveled through Belgium with Sir Max Hastings.
Ooh,
who is
that's
a military historian that some of you may know. He's written a number of those. He writes those like 500-600 page World War II history things that I admire and love to read, and maybe nobody else reads them. They make great doorstops too. They're thick, and if you have to hit a bug, bam, and we did a tour with another guy from University of Wolverhampton, Professor Gary Sheffield, who's another World War I historian, and I went over with them and a few other people. I was the youngest one, and I was also the only Canadian. Well, I'm dual citizen. I'm a UK Canadian.
How did you get into it?
I had been familiar with Hastings' book on the Falklands War. He had been a war correspondent there, and I'd read his stuff for a long time. And it was actually during when I was writing The Last Gang in Town, which I wrote pretty much from midnight till 6 a.m. every day, and then I would sleep most of the day and then get up and do it again. There'd be 6 a.m. and then I needed like some time to wind down, and I'd sort of, like anybody, see what's on Facebook or see what's on Twitter and stuff like this. And then I saw this program that him and Sheffield, Hastings and Sheffield were doing and you had to kind of apply and you had to put like a deposit down and stuff like that. And this was a year in advance, I think. And I just signed up and said, I'm going to do it. I don't care what it is. I'd been wanting to do something for a couple of years, which I haven't done yet, even of a military history of writing. And I found, in particular, Hastings writing helpful to my own civic history writing, because he was very deft at handling a number of different characters and bringing them out and getting them out. There may be just one excerpt, they're talking about a certain battle, bringing certain characters in and then bringing them back as needed, and just handling a lot of people. So just the mechanics of that writing I found helpful to what I was doing with stories of the Penthouse of the Commodore or whatever, music stories, So, but I had interest in military history, which I still do, but that was part of that. And then I think we were talking, and I have a friend who's Robert Young Pelton, who wrote a book called The World's Most Dangerous Places as well, and he's in the Royal Geographical Society. But those guys were in the Royal Historical Society. They said, Aaron, you should join. We'll sponsor you. We'll put your name down. And I said, okay, sure. And I'd love to, Now, I imagine in London, they have some great hall, with a bar and cigars that people sit around and talk about. Do you remember the old, the great days of Nairobi and things like, and that you can go to. And one day I'll go there and I'll hang out. And, hi, I'm from Vancouver, right?
My name's Jane.
Yeah. Yeah. I always think it's like that, but I don't think it is. They do a lot of, they do almost exclusively, UK history and whatnot. But it's an interesting organization. I wanted to join it, and I'm sure proud to be a part of it. Yeah.
Sorry, we've got off on a tangent. Anyone else
Yeah.
have questions?
How are we doing for time? We okay? Oh yeah, we got 15 minutes at least.
Oh
Yeah.
my God, what's time?
Yeah.
So your background, both of you are journalists originally? Or?
Yeah, I am. And yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I started. I was a musician, touring musician for many years, and I would write, between tours, or I liked doing it because it didn't involve driving 6 hours and doing a sound check somewhere. So I started writing for the Vancouver Courier, which is a newspaper weekly that's gone now, sadly. But they did so much local, features and stuff like that I can remember in 2003 or something. That would have been 2002 or 2003, I guess. I called them up and I said I pitched them some ideas. And I had worked for CBC Radio 2 prior to that for a little bit as a freelancer on some stuff, but the freelance budget evaporated rather quickly at the CBC. And I wanted to do something. I got more and more interested. I'm born and raised in Vancouver, but I did not have an interest in Vancouver history until I probably turned 30 or 25, 30, somewhere in that zone. Like anything, where you live or grow up is maybe the least interesting thing to you, and you're more interested about reading about other places. And I grew up in Kerrisdale, which was even more staid and normal and whatnot, and didn't seem exciting. And then I realized that basically the corner, I saw a photo of, basically the corner that I grew up at for the first 25 years of my life. And there's a photo of Allen Ginsberg there in 1966 or something. And I thought, what? He was there, and friends of William Burroughs were there. What the heck? And then I realized that in my backyard, the Kerrisdale Arena, the Clash had played there in 1983, or 82, pardon me, and the Jam and Devo and all these bands that I sort of loved as a teenager and stuff like that. And suddenly my own backyard, my own city got a lot more interesting to me. And I went on a Heritage Vancouver tour in 2001 that Peter Vaseboard did of Granville Street. And he talked about basically the Hudson's Bay building and those buildings down for which are now kind of residential towers and whatnot, but the individual businesses that had been there. And he knew everything about who would own these stores and what they'd sold, and it was fascinating to me. And I got interested in people like that, and people like Chuck Davis, that had written, who's we are all disciples of, that have been spread out into the world now. And Chuck was very, very supportive of what some of the writing that I was doing. I wrote about how Howard Hughes at the Weston Bay Shore in 1972, and stayed there for 6 months as a cover story for the Vancouver Courier. And that got very well received. And then I did around the time there were a lot of gang shootings in 2008 in Vancouver. I did a story called Gangs of Vancouver, which got into the old Park era gangs of the Clark Park gang and the Dunbar Park gang, Riley Park gang. And nobody had really written about those in a significant way, maybe ever, or the people who were in those gangs that didn't necessarily have access to or who they were. And that got very well received. I know people said I should have been put up for a Webster Award on that, which was very, encouraging. So I started doing things, writing, and sometimes those stories, those cover stories ended up being, for me, dress rehearsals for a book idea. Even with The Last Guy in Town, that was funny because when that article came out, receptionist at the Courier called me and said, "Hey, it's some old gang member on the phone, wants to talk to you about it." And I thought, "Oh my God, who have I upset here? And I better get out of town for a couple of days or something." And I talked to this guy, and he was an old Clark Park gang member who had been through prison and whatnot. And I said, "Oh, geez, I really enjoyed your article. It brought me back to the old days, and I could tell you some more stories sometime if you like." Now, of course, when you're writing something as a journalist, as soon as you're done with it, you're kind of done with it. And there's no need, even if somebody has a lot more information, maybe you'll put that in a notebook for later. But I didn't really have any occasion to do anything with it, because I was moving on to the next story, which is sort of what I like with the book writing. There's a little more time you can take with it, or sometimes if there's new developments that come back, you can maybe stick it in a new version or a revision of the book, or add some new stories or photos or facts or something. So I kept his number, and then maybe a year or two later, I thought maybe this would be maybe interesting to revisit as a book, I think. And then I couldn't find his number, and then I realized I'd emailed it to myself, and it was the very first email at the bottom of I hadn't looked at for 2 years, and I called him up, and they said, "Hey man, we got to talk," and that's something, I don't know with you, Eve, we all kind of learn interview techniques as we go, I think. Maybe you learn some immediately very early as a reporter, but in talking to some of the people, I don't know if you've had these occasions, but in some of the book interviews that I've done, very often is the case that I'm sitting down with something that I don't have anybody in common with, and you kind of have to placate them or make them feel comfortable enough that if there are lots of occasions where either with some retired police, especially guys of an older generation, maybe they have a little bit of politically incorrect sense of humor, or they tell a few jokes that you think, "Oh God," but you kind of got to laugh along to kind of make them feel more comfortable to talk to you. You're not being duplicitous, I think, but at least you're trying to, and there's lots of situations where I have gone to the scene of the crime, if you will, or gone to where it happened to talk to that person about, because that will immediately bring people back to those times 40, 50 years ago, and they can remember being where we are now, and sometimes that can be emotional for them. And very often, in the case I don't record, I just, when I'm meeting somebody said, "Are you going to write this down, or you're recording?" It's like, "Well, I just thought we'd meet really the first time. I don't want to, not here to exploit you or anything like that." And sometimes that puts people at rest too. And in many occasions, whether it's criminals or police or ex-criminals or police, I say, "I'll let you read what I've written before it goes to the publisher," because
that's an interesting point, because journalism 101,
you never do that.
Never.
Now, and I only do that, and I sometimes have said that hoping I'm never going to let them change it. I'm just going to show it to them and tell me, but in Last Gang in Town, I did. There was I had one of the old gangsters, and I showed him these are some of the photos I'm going to put in the book. He goes, "Wait, don't put that one in." And it turns out that one was a photo of a active organized crime figure that he and others knew, to the extent that they said they were going to talk to me and participate in whatever interviews with the book. But he said, "Just leave my name out of it if we can." And they told me that, and I thought, well, he's not really that central to the books. I wasn't really worried about it. And then I met him, and there's a whole other story to that too. That's kind of funny. But those are some of the interview things I sometimes have learned along the way. Like there was one case where I was going to meet a guy who had just done a life sentence for murder. He'd done 25 years for murder. And I didn't necessarily know, there was an intermediary who had set up that interview. And I thought, I didn't think I was walking into a dangerous situation, but I called my brother and I said, "Look, here's where I'm going. If you don't hear from me in 2 hours, something's gone wrong, or you know where I've been." And he sort of, you could see the surprise. "Are you sure?" And I go, "Yeah, I think I'm not dumb. I'm not walking something, but just in case, I feel better if you know what I'm doing." And he said, "Okay, I don't know if he said, here's another weird phone call from my brother," and put the phone down, And then as soon as we went and met, and within the first 5 minutes, I knew we were fine. He was actually quite jovial to talk to, and sometimes the people who have been through a real nightmare like that, of their own device or whatever, are the most calm, adjusted. You wouldn't think. Pick the person out of this lineup that's done 25 years in jail. Well, this seemed guy that was the last person to do it. And we had such an enjoyable conversation that 2 hours had gone by, and we're having our dessert, and we're laughing and telling, this and that, talking about the Canucks or something, or at the end or whatever off top. And I thought, "Oh, geez, I got to go phone call," And I ran outside and I phoned my brother, and it was, it was sort of 2.5 hours by this point. And he said, I was going to wait 5 more minutes, and if I didn't hear from you, but there's all sorts of things like that that have that I've walked into, or try to sort of gauge, and you get to know people a little bit, or if people feel not at ease, I won't record. So we can meet second time. I'm not looking to get all this at once from you. It might take a couple. People that drops their guard a little bit as well. They think, okay, this is a person that's just using me for a story, or they care, or they're interested in a bigger, scale of things or something.
Yeah, I've never been burned showing someone an interview afterwards.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's saved, they're fact checked.
Exactly. That's another reason, because somebody said, oh, you're mixing those two. Actually, those are 2 different days. Oh, okay. You make the note.
And I found with this new book, I'm dealing with people, the relatives of victims of unsolved murders and missing people. And it's been important for me that they're happy with what goes into the book. And so I've worked very closely with them, to the extent that they've sent 3 or 4 drafts.
Yeah.
And it's been fun.
Yeah. And that's the kind of conversation with somebody that's not just a 1 10-minute phone call. I mean, those are probably repeated.
Absolutely.
This is where I am with it. This is where we're at, or we're this far away, or now we're done. I hope you're,
there's a trust aspect built in.
Yeah, for sure. I think you definitely had that, with the Castellani story.
Oh yeah,
that went well beyond what I would have ever envisioned a book like that being, because it wasn't really Castellani's story in the end. It was his daughter's. And that she opened up to you as much as she did.
And I don't think I would have done it otherwise. The fact that she'd approached me to do it.
And
really wanted to do it from that point of view made it interesting.
Yeah.
Story. We've got a few minutes left if anyone else has questions.
Yes, sir.
Have you ever had any issue with real estate agents where they've been trying to sell a property and...
Well, this is a good one for you.
They probably don't like that.
I actually wrote a blog. It's one of my most popular blogs about how not to buy a murder house. Because so many houses have had murders in them. And a real estate agent has to disclose if a murder has taken place or they have a ghost.
Yes.
But they don't necessarily have to research it. So if they don't know, they don't
want to have to tell you.
But if they do know, they do have to disclose it. So
have you ever heard a story of somebody who wanted to buy a murder house or a ghost house? It's like, well, I can't wait to move in there and talk to the ghost or something.
In Victoria, here you talk about people with the ghost and, don't talk to me about the ghost, you'll bring down the real estate price.
Right.
But in Victoria, they're like, I'll go to see someone who was doing the book about their garden, and they'll say, oh, come in, are you here to see about the ghost? It's like,
right.
oh, yes, I am. And, they love their ghosts. They're very proud of it. Same with murders.
Yeah.
It's a dinner party conversation. So it's interesting.
Yeah. It's interesting what I was talking with Eve the other night about our meeting today, and to me, it's interesting in terms of some of the books that we write on the greater subject of Vancouver history or city history in the last few years. It strikes me that there's been a real wave of writing and interest in the subject. And these are some of the best years, I think, because there's so many different people, not just ourselves and some other bloggers or people who do a little bit of everything, like Jason Vanderhill and, some friends of ours that are working on this stuff. And I often go to bookstores and talk to people in the stores, and it's the Vancouver history books that sell just as well, or if not more, than some of the New York Times bestsellers or your Robert Ludlum books or whatever, because I think there's been a real interest in city stories of the city of the last few years. And I think that's because, I did a talk in Edmonton some time ago, and I read a portion of one of my books, and somebody came up after and said, nobody's really doing this in Edmonton. I can't think of a guy, maybe there is one. And I said, well, I'm sure if there's probably Edmonton writers that talk about Edmonton, but we've done a very good job of Vancouver of bringing the new. We haven't done the best job of keeping the old. And there's been so many changes, especially downtown Vancouver, within the city, right before our very eyes. Some of the changes that would happen in Vancouver that would normally happen in a 70-year period have happened in about 30, and since the 1990s. So I think there's a lot of people. My friends and I, even when we were in our 20s, we would get together and say, well, there used to be a bar called the Town Pump. Yeah, we used to go there all the time. We found ourselves catching ourselves talking like we sound like 80-year-old men talking about the prime of our lives, and we're all 28, 29 here. Because I think the city's changed so much. We're all trying to remember what used to be there. I can remember just walking by. I can't picture it. And so some of the stories that we're looking at, or some of these times that they're set in, are very interesting, and that's one thing that I think we always try and capture, to a certain degree in the book. And I think people will look back and this is maybe my own elevated sense of the work that we do or something, but I think people would, in the literary BC book community will look back on this last sort of 10, 15 years as a real sort of boon time for Vancouver history writing and whatnot. And there's so many more stories out there. People say to me all the time, are you going to do like a non-Vancouver book, or are you going to do something else? And like, well, I always say, well, I think I'll get to it eventually, but there's so much interesting stuff here right now. And there's so many stories, especially there's lots of Indigenous stuff coming up. There's lots of stuff from the Vancouver Asian community or South Asian communities. The city's dying for a South Asian writer to talk about some of the South Asian history in the city. That there's whole subjects that are so wide open right now that they could be the gold mine, days to research this stuff and find some of those people and get some of those people talking. I think that's what's exciting, and that's what the future is. We have many more years of this at this point, and people talk about Vancouver not having a history or not having an appreciation for its history. When I think that's ridiculous. I mean, our book sales do pretty good for people who have lots of interest. We haven't had sometimes the government bylaws to keep some heritage preservation, protect certain buildings, stuff like that happening. But there's a great interest in history here in Vancouver, from all ages. I didn't anticipate with Last Gang in Town. I figured people who were around those years would buy it from those years, but there's a whole wave of people in their 20s who live up in that area around Clark Park now that want to read how their neighborhood used to be,
Well, I went on your tour the other week.
Yes.
It's fantastic.
Yeah. So it's an interesting time, and I think it's a pretty exciting time to be writing about the city in this way. And I don't see us sort of hitting the bottom of the tank, yet or anything. There's lots of interesting stuff that you've been digging up, lots of amazing things, and there's more stuff to come, I think, from other people aside from us.
When I did Vancouver Exposed, it's sort of based on my blog, and it's a sort of big book with lots of pictures. And most of it was based on pictures that I'd get from the archives. And then COVID hit and everything shut down.
Yeah.
And so I ended up going to collectors, friends that we know, like Tom and all his
Sure.
friends, and say, hey, does anyone have these photos? And they just poured in. It was fantastic. So
Yeah.
got all these, incredible information that I wouldn't have known about
Yeah.
had that not happened. So, yeah, all these albums are around in people's basements and things waiting to,
Yeah.
us to-
And social media's been good for that too. When you
Yeah.
sometimes put out feelers,
Oh,
does
sure.
anybody have anything like this? What I'm working on now is a book. Well, I got 3 books on the go here over the next few years, but the city one has to do with Vancouver restaurant history. There's so many places that have come and gone in the past that were sort of benchmark places, but some of the people who ran them either were some of the most crooked people you've ever met in your life, or people who could have been Fortune 500, presidents or something. They just had a great acumen from any business they would have touched. And it's interesting when you look and see, what we've eaten in Vancouver. You can see how the city's changed. You can see how the waves of immigration affect when sushi started happening, or we have some more Latin fare. All these sort of things. If you look at the 1940s and 50s, it's kind of cafeteria food. Nothing really exciting to write home about. Even restaurants that people liked, or fond memories of them. It's just like, well, it's kind of a grilled cheese sandwich you got. That's all, it was nice, but whatever. So I've been working on that. It's been interesting to connect with some of the people who worked in these places, or their parents. So they have their parents' stories, or whatnot. Because if you really look at it, as I say, taking the lens of what we've eaten in town, you can see how the city's changed in a weird way. So that's
And look,
2026. You got to wait for that one.
It's amazing to me the engagement that you're getting. Like, people are really excited.
Yeah,
about this and
yeah.
really want
It feels good to sort of have that interest. That's out there. So, and when's your book coming out again?
About 2 weeks.
Oh, there we go. Hit the stores, folks. Rush to get it. And this is in stores too. You can get that one if you don't already have.
I think that's
Are we close to?
right, is it?
Oh, 159, right on the nose.
We did it.
Thanks for coming, everybody.
Thank you
Thanks to
very
those of you at home that are watching in your pajamas.